In the days following Sadat's assassination, a presidential referendum was hastily arranged. And there was only one candidate, Mubarak. For the Egyptian people, it seemed that history was repeating itself.
They were about to witness the inheritance of power. Egyptians are used to being ruled by a centralized government, and this originates from the pharaonic era. The pharaoh then was both a ruler and a god. Although the divinity disappeared with time, some of its features have become immortalized through our constitution.
When Hosni Mubarak assumed his new role as president, his actions proved to be just as calculated as those of his predecessors. His early days were marked by apparently compassionate gestures.
He started by setting free the political detainees from Sadat's era in an attempt to create some sort of political stability through an act of forgiveness.
There was an atmosphere of hope and new beginnings in Egypt. In these early years, Mubarak was a popular figure. Egyptians were attracted to the simplicity of their down-to-earth president, who attended football matches and spoke in common language that even the average man on the street could understand.
I got the impression from meeting him that he was an intelligent man who preferred to work around problems than to confront them. I got the feeling that he is not a dictator by nature, or someone who strives to gain as much power and authority as possible.
On the 25th of April 1982, a new era of peace was being ushered in as Israel completed its evacuation of the Sinai. Mubarak introduced his new national project to the Egyptians, rebuilding the country after decades of conflict.
The economic situation in Egypt was terrible. The country was in severe debt, and its infrastructure was damaged. There was a serious need to rebuild road, sewage systems, healthcare, and other services which had been neglected. This was a priority during the 80s because it was believed that if you worked on building and strengthening the economy, political reform would just follow.
More roads and bridges began to appear, and most Egyptians could see the government was making an effort. But the people needed more than just infrastructure to earn their loyalty.
You can talk to the citizen about new bridges and remind them how difficult traveling was before. Or point out that now they have access to water, a proper sewerage system, and electricity in 99% of residential areas. We have achieved a lot, but people aren't grateful. All they will say is, that is the government's job.
Mubarak's regime had shifted from the bold political gestures of Nasser and Sadat to a safer approach, one that focused on the economy. But some Egyptians suspected they were not the biggest beneficiaries of this new investment.
Over the last 25 years, general expenditure in Egypt has been mainly aimed at benefiting businessmen and directed towards infrastructure. 600 billion Egyptian pounds, that is over $100 billion, was spent, which is a scary figure for a country like Egypt. This would have been useful to the public had the private sector invested in this infrastructure, and if it was developed in compliance with proper standards. Yet you only have to drive along any road in Egypt to see for yourself the effect of corruption.
Politically, things were calm because of the economic stability, because there was an escape route from the pressures of unemployment. There were a number of countries people could go to, and Iraq in particular accepted millions of Egyptians looking for opportunities to work or live.
So long as there was food on the table, many Egyptians were unconcerned about politics. And the Egyptian political system was not yet ready for their involvement either. President Sadat had abolished the single-party system in 1976, but the change was a cosmetic one, and to all intents and purposes, Egypt remained a one-party state.
Sadat was an autocratic democracy, and the Egyptian political experience was one of a society only familiar with the governing power of a single group. And this mentality of the one-party rule continued until now during President Mubarak's rule. This course of thought was planted in the minds of many politicians.
And Mubarak was happy to drift with the tide. At the start of his presidency in 1981, he had declared that he would only serve 2 6-year terms. But when he was easily re-elected in 1987 and again in 1993, it appeared that a pattern was emerging. With the field free of powerful candidates who could threaten his position, and with no vice president appointed, Mubarak seemed set to stay. It seemed that internally Mubarak had everything under control, and internationally things were also going according to plan. Egypt managed to mend its relations with the Arab countries despite its ongoing peace treaty with Israel.
One of Mubarak's unique characteristics is his ability to control his responses and temper, despite his military background. This prevented Egypt from committing mistakes that often result from political miscommunication. In general, he was very wise when dealing with international politics.
Further afield, Mubarak was also well regarded by the leaders of the United States, Europe, and even Israel. He was respected for his composure and modesty.
President Mubarak realized that he was only one of many players and thereby had to deal his cards cleverly, with a relative level of sensitivity, accuracy, and intellect.
By now, Mubarak was very much the international statesman, but within Egypt, the ghosts of the past were returning to haunt him. During the early 90s, Egypt witnessed a string of attacks against tourists and a number of assassination attempts on members of the regime at the hands of Islamist groups. Mubarak was on their list. Inside Egypt, he ensured he had a high level of protection, but on the 26th of June 1995 in the Ethiopian capital Addis Ababa, an assassination attempt was carried out against the president. Mubarak escaped thanks to his armored car and the actions of his bodyguards. It was a close call which gained him sympathy and renewed popularity from his people, but it also raised a new question. What would happen if?
We don't have a democratic system or a vice president. Therefore, of course, there was danger and questions started to be asked. What would happen in the event of a power vacuum in Egypt? This question is being asked by many people in Egypt, but no one can accurately give the answer.
During the 80s and 90s, the Egyptian regime continually deflected questions on political reform. They even dismissed calls for ending the state of emergency, in place since the assassination of Anwar al-Sadat in 1981. Instead, they repeated the so-called national priorities, rebuilding the economy and countering the threat of terrorism.
We had daily and weekly terrorist attacks. When a political party feels that the state is in danger, it must focus on safety before reform.
But despite the increased security steps taken by the government, the violence reached its peak in November 1997. In the ancient city of Luxor, a massacre took the lives of 58 tourists. The Egyptian tourist industry was devastated. And by the end of the century, the economy was facing a new problem. The petrodollars sent home by Egyptian workers in Iraq began to dry up following US-imposed sanctions. Other Gulf states began to close their doors to foreign labor too. Problems which had been deferred but not solved began to resurface. Government promises of economic growth were starting to sound hollow.
By their nature, Egyptians will keep quiet when it comes to politics as long as they're compensated in some way, economically or socially. But the circle was closing in on them, and they were being faced with only one option: the fate of a slave.